I think you saved my life once." The words caught Evelyn completely off guard. She looked at the man standing beneath the old oak tree outside the neighborhood literacy center, searching his face for some hint that they had met before. Behind them, volunteers folded chairs, while a few children laughed as they chased each other toward the parking lot. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Nothing about it suggested her world was quietly shifting again. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said with an apologetic smile. "I don't think I remember you." The man didn't seem disappointed. Instead, he nodded gently, as though he'd expected that answer. "Years ago," he said, "you paid for a stranger to print an important presentation because he couldn't afford it." Evelyn frowned, reaching through memories that refused to come into focus. "I don't." "You also told him everybody needs someone to believe in them on a hard day." For a brief second, she stopped breathing, not because she remembered the man, because those sounded exactly like something she would have said without thinking twice. Before she could ask another question, her phone vibrated in her hand. One message: Michael, the husband who had walked away from their 8-year marriage just 3 weeks earlier for another woman. "Can we talk? I made a terrible mistake." Evelyn looked down at the screen, then slowly raised her eyes to the quiet stranger standing in front of her. One man had carried a small kindness she couldn't even remember giving. The other had walked away from a love she had spent 8 years trying to protect. Welcome to Mr. Hartley's story. To everyone who has supported this channel, thank you for being part of this incredible journey. We're growing every day, improving every day, and bringing you even better content ahead. If you're new here, comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And make sure you subscribe to officially join the family. 3 weeks before everything came apart, Evelyn Carter still believed she understood the shape of her life. Most weekday mornings began the same way. She parked outside the elementary school in Savannah a few minutes before the first bell, balanced a travel mug of coffee in one hand, and unlocked the library while the hallways were still quiet. The room always smelled faintly of paper, crayons, and furniture polish. Before the students arrived, she'd straighten books that didn't need straightening and leave a different picture book on display near the entrance, hoping it might catch someone's attention. She loved watching children discover a story they hadn't expected to enjoy. Some of them wandered in every morning before class, pretending they were only there to return books. Evelyn knew better. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," one little boy said, carefully placing a dinosaur book on the desk. "Finished already? I read it twice." She smiled. "Then I think you've earned something even bigger." Moments like that never made the news. They never came with promotions or applause, but they filled her days in ways she found difficult to explain. When school ended, she drove home to the small house she and Michael had bought 5 years earlier. It wasn't perfect. The porch creaked after heavy rain, one kitchen cabinet refused to close properly, and the living room still held the same second-hand coffee table they'd promised each other they would replace. They never did. Somehow, it became part of the house's personality. Friday nights belonged to them. One of them picked up takeout on the way home, while the other searched every streaming service for a movie. They almost never agreed on what to watch. "You've already seen that one," Michael would complain. "So have you." "That's different." "It really isn't." 20 minutes later, they'd usually settle for a movie neither of them loved, eat dinner from cardboard containers, and spend half the film talking over the dialogue anyway. It wasn't exciting. It didn't need to be. Evelyn had never measured happiness by how impressive it looked from the outside. She measured it by habits. The second cup of coffee Michael always poured before she asked. The way he automatically reached for her hand while crossing busy streets. The grocery list they forgot on the kitchen counter almost every Saturday. Little things became proof that two people were building a life instead of performing one. When Michael received a long-awaited promotion at the marketing firm where he worked, Evelyn celebrated as though it had happened to both of them. She baked his favorite chocolate cake, even though it leaned slightly to one side after she took it out of the oven. "It's still ugly," she admitted, laughing. "It's our tradition," Michael replied before blowing out the candle she'd jokingly stuck in the middle. For a while, nothing seemed different. He came home with stories about new clients and bigger projects. Sometimes he mentioned coworkers who talked about waterfront homes, expensive vacations, or investment opportunities that sounded completely foreign to Evelyn. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions she barely understood. They all seem successful, she said one evening. Michael shrugged as he loosened his tie. They've figured some things out. She thought he sounded impressed. She didn't realize he sounded restless. The change arrived so gradually, it barely looked like change at all. He started checking work emails during dinner. Networking dinners appeared on the calendar more often than family visits. Weekends that once belonged to lazy mornings and errands slowly became filled with business events Evelyn wasn't always invited to attend. Whenever she asked whether work had become overwhelming, Michael answered almost automatically, "It's just a busy season." She believed him. After all, people who loved each other were supposed to give each other room during difficult seasons. Looking back, that was probably the first misunderstanding. Evelyn thought they were protecting the marriage by giving each other space. She never considered they might be growing used to living inside separate worlds. The first thing Evelyn noticed wasn't that Michael talked more, it was that he asked fewer questions. For years he'd come home and ask how story hour had gone, whether one of her struggling readers had made progress or which child had insisted on checking out 5 books even though they could barely carry them. Now, dinner conversations drifted somewhere else. "Do you know what one of the senior managers drives?" Michael asked one evening as he stirred his pasta without taking a bite. Evelyn smiled. "No, a Porsche." She laughed softly. "I guess that's nice if you like sports cars." He didn't laugh with her. "It's not really about the car." "What is it about?" He searched for the right words. "It's what it represents." Evelyn nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood. Over the next few months, those conversations became more common. Someone at work had bought a lake house. Someone else had doubled their investments. Another coworker had just returned from Italy after extending a business trip into a 2-week vacation. Michael never sounded jealous exactly, more like he had started measuring his own life against lives he hadn't cared about before. One Saturday afternoon, they drove through one of Savannah's newer neighborhoods after leaving a home improvement store. Large brick houses lined quiet streets shaded by young oak trees. Landscaping crews trimmed hedges with almost perfect precision. Michael slowed the car. "Imagine living here." Evelyn looked out the window. "It's beautiful. It could be us one day." She reached over and squeezed his arm. "I'm happy wherever we are." He smiled politely. It wasn't the kind of smile that reached his eyes. At school, nothing about Evelyn had changed. Children still ran toward the library every Monday morning. Parents still thanked her for recommending books that finally convinced reluctant readers to keep trying. One afternoon, Lily's mother stopped her outside the library. "I don't know what you did," she said, "but she reads to her little brother every night now." Evelyn felt the familiar warmth that always came with moments like that. When she told Michael over dinner, hoping to share the joy, he looked up from his phone. "That's great." There was nothing wrong with his answer. It was simply over too quickly. She waited, expecting another question. There wasn't one. He glanced back down at the screen. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "Work stuff." A few seconds passed. Then he added, "Actually, we're planning a networking event next month. You'll have fun. You could come." "I'd love to." He hesitated. "It's mostly clients and executives." She noticed the pause. "So, you don't think I'd enjoy it?" "No, that's not what I meant." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I just don't want you to feel out of place." The words hung between them, longer than either expected. Evelyn smiled anyway. "I've spent my career helping 8-year-olds debate whether dragons are real. I think I can survive one networking event." Michael smiled back, but there was something distracted about it. A week later, he told her the guest list had become limited. She believed him. She wanted to. Around that same time, Michael began mentioning a coworker named Vanessa, never excessively, never in a way that sounded inappropriate. Vanessa landed the Henderson account. "Vanessa's putting together tomorrow's presentation. Vanessa knows everyone in commercial real estate." To Evelyn, Vanessa sounded competent, ambitious, confident, the kind of person every office seemed to have. She never felt threatened. If anything, she was glad Michael had found colleagues he enjoyed working with. She trusted him. Trust had never been something they negotiated. It had simply existed. One Friday evening, their usual takeout sat untouched on the coffee table, while another movie trailer played on the television. Normally, one of them would have made a joke by now. Instead, Michael's phone lit up. He looked down, typed a quick reply, locked the screen. Almost immediately, it buzzed again. "Everything okay?" Evelyn asked. "Yeah." "Work?" "Just someone asking about Monday." He reached for his food, but he'd already missed half the conversation they hadn't been having. Evelyn looked toward the television, though she couldn't have said what was playing. For the first time in years, silence inside their home didn't feel comfortable. It felt occupied. The conversation that ended their marriage lasted less than 20 minutes. Looking back, Evelyn sometimes wondered if that made it easier or harder. It happened on a Tuesday. She had just finished grading reading journals she'd brought home from school when she heard Michael's car pull into the driveway earlier than usual. She smiled to herself. For a brief second, she thought maybe they could order dinner instead of cooking. When he walked inside, he didn't call out the familiar, "I'm home." He set his keys on the entry table with unusual care. "Evelyn?" "I'm in here." She looked up as he entered the living room. Instead of sitting beside her on the couch like he always did, he chose the chair across from her. It was such a small decision. It changed the entire room. "You okay?" she asked. Michael rubbed his palms together before answering. "We need to talk." She lowered the notebook onto the coffee table. "What happened?" He looked at her for several seconds without speaking. "I don't know how to say this without hurting you." Her stomach tightened. "Then just say it." He inhaled slowly. "I've fallen in love with someone else." The words were calm, almost rehearsed. Evelyn stared at him, waiting for the sentence to correct itself. It didn't. "Vanessa?" she asked quietly. His silence answered before he did. "I never meant for this to happen." She blinked once, then again. "How long?" "I don't know exactly." "You don't know?" "It wasn't planned." She searched his face for the man she'd spent nearly 8 years with. "I thought we were going through a difficult season." "We have been." "So why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know how." He looked exhausted, not angry, not defensive, just distant. "I deserve to be happy, Evelyn." She swallowed. "And you think you can't be happy with me?" Michael lowered his eyes. "I think we've become different people." The room became painfully quiet. Outside, a lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. A dog barked. Someone laughed across the neighborhood. Life continued with astonishing indifference. Michael stood first. "I've already packed a few things." Evelyn turned toward the hallway, just as he rolled 2 suitcases into the living room. She hadn't even heard him packing. That realization hurt almost as much as everything else. "You planned this." "I didn't want to make it harder." She almost asked if he was coming back. Instead, she heard herself say, "Drive safely." For the first time that evening, emotion crossed his face. He nodded once. "Goodbye, Evelyn." She remained on the couch as the front door opened, then closed. A second later, she heard the suitcase wheels bump across the front porch before fading into the distance. The silence afterward felt unfamiliar, not because the house was empty, because it still looked exactly the same. His coffee mug was in the sink. His jacket still hung beside the front door. Their grocery list remained attached to the refrigerator with the same magnet they'd bought during a weekend trip years earlier. Everything suggested someone was coming home, except no one was. The weeks that followed were strangely ordinary. Bills arrived on schedule. The grass grew whether she felt like mowing it or not. Every Monday morning, children filled the library expecting story hour to begin with the same smile they had always known. So Evelyn smiled, not because she wasn't hurting, because 6-year-olds shouldn't have to carry the weight of an adult's heartbreak. The hardest moments were never the nights. They arrived without warning, reaching for 2 coffee mugs before putting one back, finding one of Michael's jackets in the hallway closet and standing there longer than she meant to, opening a piece of junk mail addressed to both of them. Each reminder lasted only seconds. Its effect lingered much longer. Then, one Saturday morning, she stopped at a neighborhood grocery store for milk and bread. "Evelyn!" She turned to see Lily, one of her fourth-grade students, waving enthusiastically from the cereal aisle. "Aren't you coming today?" Lily asked. "You promised you'd read the pirate story at the Literacy Center." For a moment, Evelyn almost apologized. She was tired. The thought of smiling through another afternoon felt impossible. Then she looked at Lily's hopeful expression. "I'll be there," Evelyn said. As Lily ran back to her mother, Evelyn realized it was the first promise she'd made for herself since Michael walked out the front door. She had no idea that keeping it would quietly change the direction of her life. The Literacy Center occupied an old brick building tucked between a neighborhood church and a small community park. The paint along the front steps had faded years ago, and the sign above the entrance leaned slightly to one side. It wasn't impressive. Nobody seemed to mind. Every Saturday, volunteers unlocked the doors, arranged folding tables, sharpened pencils, and stacked donated books according to reading level instead of appearance. Children arrived carrying backpacks, half-finished breakfasts, and more energy than the room could contain. Evelyn walked in carrying a canvas tote filled with picture books she'd borrowed from the school library. "Glad you made it," the coordinator said. "Lily's been asking if you were coming all morning." Evelyn smiled. I couldn't disappoint her. Within minutes, she was surrounded by children arguing over pirates, dinosaurs, astronauts, and which story should come first. For 2 hours, she barely thought about anything outside those walls. No unopened mail waiting at home. No empty side of the bed. No questions she couldn't answer. Only stories. When the reading session ended, everyone pitched in. Books returned to shelves. Markers found their way back into containers, except for the ones that somehow disappeared every week. One volunteer crouched beneath a table searching for puzzle pieces. Another swept cracker crumbs off the floor. Near the back of the room, a man in a faded navy baseball cap quietly repaired a loose bookshelf with a screwdriver someone had left in a supply cabinet. Evelyn had noticed him earlier helping two brothers sound out difficult words without ever making them feel embarrassed. He never raised his voice, never tried to become the center of attention. He simply moved wherever someone needed help. As she carried a box of books toward the storage room, one slipped from the top of the stack. Before it hit the floor, someone caught it. "I've got it." She looked up. The man in the baseball cap handed the book back with an easy smile. "Thanks." "No problem." There was a brief silence before Evelyn asked, "Do shelves always collapse around here?" He laughed. "Only on Saturdays." "So it's tradition?" "I think it's in the volunteer handbook." She smiled despite herself. "I'm Evelyn." "Daniel." That was all. No awkward introductions. No attempts to impress each other. A few minutes later, they found themselves carrying another box together. "Do you volunteer here every week?" Evelyn asked. "Most weeks." "What made you start?" Daniel adjusted the box in his arms. "I had some extra time." She glanced sideways. "That's a very mysterious answer." "I've been told that before." "And?" "I've ignored it every time." She laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she'd heard from herself in weeks. The sound surprised her almost as much as it did him. When they reached the storage room, Daniel held the door open while Evelyn stepped inside. "See you next Saturday?" he asked. "I think so. I'll make sure the bookshelves behave." "No promises?" "None." She shook her head as she walked away. For reasons she couldn't explain, the conversation lingered with her during the drive home. Not because it had been important, because it hadn't tried to be. Across town, Daniel loaded empty cardboard boxes into the recycling bin before locking the center's side entrance. He paused beside his truck. Something about Evelyn felt familiar. Not her voice, not exactly her face. Something smaller, the way she listened without interrupting. The way she thanked every child who returned a book, even if it came back with folded pages. The feeling stayed with him all afternoon. By evening, he had almost convinced himself he was imagining it. Still, as he drove home, he caught himself searching old memories for a name he couldn't quite reach. He had the unmistakable feeling that he'd met Evelyn long before that Saturday. He simply couldn't remember where. The following Saturday, the Literacy Center filled up even faster than usual. A summer reading challenge had brought in several new families, and every table was occupied within minutes. Daniel was helping a nervous third grader named Noah work through a chapter book when he noticed Evelyn across the room. The boy beside her kept stopping after every few words. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm slow." Evelyn didn't reach for the book. She didn't finish the sentence for him. She simply slid the chair a little closer. "Take your time," she said. "Nobody's keeping score." Daniel froze. The words reached him before the memory did. He had heard that sentence before. Not exactly those words, but close enough that something stirred. Suddenly, he wasn't standing inside the literacy center anymore. He was back inside a public library nearly 8 years earlier. The air conditioning had barely worked that afternoon, and every computer seemed occupied except one near the back wall. His laptop had crashed less than 12 hours before the biggest investor meeting of his life. The presentation he'd spent weeks preparing was gone. After hours of recovering files, he'd managed to email himself one final copy. Now he only needed to print it. He stood at the circulation desk, counting the cash in his wallet for the 3rd time. It wasn't enough. He quietly removed several pages from the printing queue, trying to decide which charts he could explain without showing, and which pages might matter too much to leave behind. "Excuse me." He looked up. A young librarian stood behind the counter. Her name tag read, "Evelyn." "You don't have to leave anything out," she said gently. He felt his face grow warm. "I'm fine." She didn't argue. She only glanced toward the screen. "We have a small community assistance fund for situations like this." "I couldn't ask you to." "You didn't." Before he could protest again, she finished printing the presentation, organized every page into the correct order, and placed them neatly inside a folder. "There you go." Daniel reached for his wallet. "I'll pay you back." She smiled as if the idea had never mattered. "When things get better, help someone else." He hesitated. "I don't even know if this meeting is going to work." She handed him the folder. Everybody needs someone to believe in them on a hard day. That was it. No speech, no lecture. She turned to help the next person waiting in line, as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel walked into the investor meeting carrying far more than printed pages. He carried the feeling that one stranger had looked at him without seeing failure. The meeting hadn't changed his life overnight. There were more setbacks, more rejected pitches, months when he wondered whether he should walk away. Whenever that happened, he remembered the librarian who had treated him with dignity when embarrassment would have been easier. Years later, his software company finally broke through. Investors returned. Growth accelerated. Eventually, the business sold for more money than Daniel had ever imagined possible. People later called him visionary, disciplined, brilliant. Almost no one knew that one of the hardest days of his journey had been interrupted by someone who refused to let him feel ashamed. Back at the literacy center, Noah finished the final paragraph. "I did it," he said, grinning. "You absolutely did," Evelyn replied. Daniel watched her for another moment. She had no idea. She wasn't performing kindness. She wasn't trying to inspire anyone. She was simply being the same person she'd been all those years ago. For the first time since recognizing that old memory, Daniel wasn't wondering whether he'd met Evelyn before. He knew. The only question left was whether she would remember him. Somehow, he already suspected the answer would be no. Daniel had plenty of chances to tell Evelyn the truth. He chose not to. The next Saturday, they found themselves organizing donated books before the children arrived. "Who keeps donating 3 copies of the same cookbook?" Evelyn asked, holding up identical paperbacks. Daniel looked over. "Maybe they're trying to improve everyone's meatloaf." "I don't think 3 copies will help." "I admire your optimism." She laughed and placed the books in the donation box marked "Not for Children's Collection." Their conversations stayed like that, easy, uncomplicated. Neither of them asked questions that felt too personal. When the reading sessions ended, they sometimes walked to the small coffee shop across the street with a few other volunteers. Most of the conversation revolved around the children. "Marcus read an entire chapter by himself today," Evelyn said one afternoon. Daniel nodded. He smiled before he even realized he'd finished. "That's my favorite part." "What is?" "When they stop worrying about getting every word right." Daniel stirred his coffee. "You notice things most people miss." She shrugged. "It's part of the job." He almost smiled. No, he thought. It's part of who you are. As the weeks passed, Evelyn began looking forward to Saturdays in a way that surprised her. Not because she expected anything dramatic, because no one there expected her to pretend. The volunteers knew she had gone through a divorce. No one pressed for details. They simply made room for her without making her feel fragile. That suited her. One afternoon, while stacking chairs after the children left, Daniel asked, "How long have you worked at the school library?" "Almost 9 years." "You still enjoy it?" She looked at him as though the answer were obvious. "I can't imagine doing anything else." "Even though it probably doesn't pay what you deserve?" She smiled. "My students don't measure success that way." Daniel nodded slowly. "I've spent time around people who do." She noticed something change in his expression. Not sadness, recognition. "You don't miss it?" she asked. He took a moment before answering. "I don't miss conversations where every achievement has to be compared to someone else's." She studied him for a second. "You say that like you've lived it." "I have." He left it there. She didn't push. There was something comforting about the fact that neither of them seemed interested in impressing the other. Meanwhile, across town, Michael was beginning to notice things he had ignored before. Dinner with Vanessa usually happened at expensive restaurants she'd chosen. She liked trying the newest places. She liked talking about promotions, market trends, and the people everyone else seemed to know. One evening, she looked up from her phone. "You still have that old house?" Michael frowned. "For now. You should probably sell it." "It isn't that simple." "Why not?" He hesitated. "It's home." The word surprised even him. Vanessa looked puzzled. "I thought you wanted something better." "I did." Her smile faded. "So what's the problem?" Michael didn't answer. Over the next several weeks, their differences became harder to ignore. Conversations that had once felt exciting now felt competitive. Neither of them meant to hurt the other, but they rarely seemed to want the same things at the same time. For the first time since leaving Evelyn, Michael drove past the neighborhood where they'd lived together. He slowed near the familiar street. The porch light was on. Instinctively, he imagined Evelyn inside reading on the couch. He almost turned into the driveway. Instead, he kept driving. Back at the literacy center the following Saturday, Daniel watched Evelyn kneel beside a little girl struggling to tie her shoelaces before story hour. Without saying a word, Evelyn tied the first loop, then let the child finish the second one herself. "See," she said, "you only needed someone to get you started." Daniel looked away for a moment. He had spent years believing he wanted to thank the woman who had once helped him. Now he wasn't so sure. Gratitude had been simple. Getting to know her was becoming something much harder to explain. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself wondering whether revealing the truth too soon might change everything. Saturday afternoons always ended the same way. The last family drifted out the front door, volunteers stacked chairs against the wall, and someone made one final sweep through the reading room looking for forgotten water bottles and crayons. That afternoon, Evelyn carried a box of picture books toward the storage closet while Daniel gathered the remaining puzzles. When everything was finally put away, they stepped outside together. The late afternoon sun filtered through the old oak trees that shaded the sidewalk. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Daniel turned the paperback he was holding over in his hands. "I've been meaning to ask you something." Evelyn looked at him. "Okay." He hesitated. "Did you ever work at the public library downtown?" She nodded. "Years ago, before I started at the elementary school." He smiled to himself. "I thought so. You've been there?" "A long time ago." She waited, sensing there was more. Daniel looked toward the parking lot before meeting her eyes again. "Do you remember helping someone print a presentation because he couldn't afford all the pages?" Evelyn searched her memory. There had been hundreds of patrons. College students, parents, job seekers, people filling out housing applications, people printing resumes. She slowly shook her head. "I'm sorry. I don't remember. I didn't think you would." There wasn't any disappointment in his voice, only certainty. "You told him something that day." He paused. "Everybody needs someone to believe in them on a hard day." Evelyn blinked. Those words sounded familiar. Not because she remembered saying them to him, because they sounded exactly like something she might have said to anyone who walked through those doors, carrying more worry than confidence. Daniel smiled gently. That stranger was me. She stared at him. You? He nodded. My laptop had crashed the night before an investor meeting. I barely had enough money to print part of the presentation. Her expression changed, not into recognition, into concern. Oh. You never made me explain why I couldn't pay. I honestly don't remember. I know. He laughed softly. That's the point. She looked down for a second. I wish I could remember your face. You weren't trying to remember me. He shrugged. You were helping the next person before I even walked out the door. Evelyn folded her arms against the light breeze. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. He looked around the quiet parking lot. I've wanted to thank you for years. She frowned. For printing papers? No. For treating me like I still mattered. The sentence settled between them. No dramatic music, no emotional speech. Only two people standing outside an aging literacy center while traffic passed at the end of the street. Evelyn looked at him carefully. I wish I'd known. I'm glad you didn't. She tilted her head. Why? Because then you might have remembered it for the wrong reason. She smiled, confused. I still don't understand. You helped me because you thought someone needed help. He held her gaze. If you'd known what would happen to my life later, it wouldn't have meant as much. Evelyn let out a small breath. I wasn't thinking about anyone's future. I know. Honestly, I probably went home and worried more about whether I'd forgotten to lock the library doors. Daniel laughed. I believe that. She laughed, too. For the first time since he'd met her, the distance between gratitude and friendship felt much smaller. Daniel had spent years imagining what this conversation might be like. He'd expected relief. Instead, he found himself admiring something even more than her kindness. She genuinely couldn't understand why anyone would remember an act she'd never considered extraordinary. Standing there beneath the oak trees, Daniel realized the memory had stayed with him all those years because for Evelyn, it hadn't been a special moment at all. It had simply been who she was. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. They crossed the street to the small coffee shop where several volunteers usually stopped after cleanup. By late afternoon, most of the tables were empty. A college student worked behind the counter while soft jazz played through ceiling speakers. Evelyn wrapped both hands around a paper cup of tea. Daniel stared at his coffee for a moment before speaking. There's something else I should probably tell you. She smiled. I've noticed that's how most surprising conversations begin. He laughed. Fair enough. He took a slow breath. The presentation you helped me print, it was for a software company I was trying to build. You mentioned an investor meeting. I did. It eventually worked. It took years. His answer was matter of fact. No overnight success? He shook his head. I wish. There were contracts that fell through, months when payroll kept me awake at night, and more than one conversation where people politely explained why my idea would never work. And you kept going. I remembered that somebody I'd never met believed I was worth helping before I'd proved anything. Evelyn lowered her eyes for a second. I still don't think I deserve that much credit. I know you don't. He smiled. That's another reason I wanted to find you. She looked at him curiously. Daniel reached into his wallet and slid an old, worn business card across the table. It was faded around the edges. I've carried that since the day of the meeting. Evelyn picked it up carefully. On the back, written in blue ink, were two words. Keep going. She looked up. I wrote this? You did. I don't even remember. You probably wrote dozens of encouraging notes to people. She smiled sheepishly. I suppose librarians become accidental cheerleaders. He nodded. For me, it mattered. There was another brief silence. Finally, Daniel said what he'd avoided for weeks. The company was eventually sold. That's wonderful. It sold for more money than I ever expected. She studied his face. You don't sound excited. I was. He leaned back in his chair. For a while. She waited. When people learned who I was, conversations changed. In what way? Some wanted advice before they knew my name. Others wanted introductions, investments, or favors. A few people decided we were suddenly close friends. He smiled without humor. It became difficult to know who was talking to me, and who was talking to what they imagined I could do for them. Evelyn understood more than he realized. That sounds lonely. It was. And that's why you volunteer. The children don't care about magazine articles. They probably wouldn't read them anyway. He laughed. No, they only care if you show up. Evelyn nodded slowly. I understand that part. She traced one finger around the rim of her cup. When Michael left, she stopped herself. Daniel didn't interrupt. She appreciated that. After a few seconds, she continued. I kept wondering how I missed what was happening. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She sounded genuinely puzzled. I trusted my own judgment for years. She looked out the window. Now I catch myself questioning things I never questioned before. Daniel answered carefully. Being deceived doesn't mean your instincts were wrong. She looked back at him. It doesn't? No. It means someone made choices you weren't given the chance to see. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't meant to fix anything. They simply gave her a different way to look at something she'd been carrying alone. For the first time since Michael walked out of their house, Evelyn felt something she hadn't expected from another person. Not pity, not advice, not reassurance. She felt understood. As they stood to leave, Daniel held the coffee shop door open for her. Neither noticed the business magazine displayed near the register. On the cover was a familiar photograph. The headline identified Daniel Brooks as the entrepreneur whose software company had recently become one of the largest acquisitions in the industry. Evelyn walked past it without a second glance. Daniel noticed. He smiled to himself. For the first time in years, someone had spent an entire afternoon talking to him without caring who the world believed he was. Monday afternoon settled into its usual rhythm. Story hour had ended. The last class had returned to their classrooms, and Evelyn was shelving a stack of books when her phone vibrated inside the desk drawer. She ignored it. Parents occasionally called during school hours, and she preferred to return messages after the students had gone home. A few minutes later, it vibrated again. When the library was finally empty, she glanced at the screen. Michael. She stared at his name longer than she expected. There were 3 missed calls, 1 voicemail, and a single text. Can we meet? Please. I made a terrible mistake. She locked the phone without listening to the voicemail. That evening, she carried her groceries into the house, set the bags on the kitchen counter, and noticed the silence waiting for her the way it always did. The message lingered in her mind anyway, not because she wanted him back, because unanswered questions had a way of making ordinary evenings feel crowded. The next morning, she mentioned the message to her friend and fellow teacher, Rachel, while they straightened books before school. Rachel stopped what she was doing. He called? Evelyn nodded. 3 times. What are you going to do? I honestly don't know. Rachel leaned against the bookshelf. If you're asking whether I'd take him back. I'm not. Good. Evelyn smiled faintly. I don't think I could. Rachel's expression softened. But part of me wants to know why. Careful. I know. You can want answers without giving someone another chance. Those words stayed with Evelyn long after the conversation ended. Saturday arrived sooner than she expected. She volunteered at the literacy center as usual, determined not to let Michael's message occupy the entire week. Daniel noticed something was different almost immediately. Not because she seemed upset, because she was quieter. She smiled at the children. She laughed when Marcus insisted pirates were better than astronauts. She helped Noah sound out another difficult chapter. But every so often, her attention drifted. As they stacked chairs after the session, Daniel spoke first. Long week? She looked up. Was it that obvious? Only if someone knows what you usually look like. She considered that. Then she sighed. My ex-husband called. Daniel waited. He wants to meet. He didn't ask why. He says he made a mistake. Daniel nodded once. And how do you feel about that? I don't know. She looked toward the empty reading tables. I've imagined this conversation 100 different ways. And now that it's here, it feels smaller than I expected. He understood. Sometimes reality arrived without matching the version people rehearsed in their heads. After a moment, Evelyn asked, "What would you do?" Daniel rested both hands on the back of a folding chair. I don't think that question has one right answer. She smiled. That's not very helpful. I know, he smiled back, but I do believe something. She waited. Forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. She looked at him without speaking. You can forgive someone, he continued, and still decide they no longer belong in the life you're trying to build. There was no judgment in his voice, no hidden hope that she would choose one path over another, only respect. Evelyn let the words settle. I think I need to meet him. Daniel didn't react immediately. Do you want him back? No. Then why? She looked toward the front windows, where a few children were waving goodbye from the parking lot. Because I don't want the last chapter of my marriage to be the only chapter I remember. Daniel nodded slowly. That sounds like closure. I hope so. As they walked outside together, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street. Inside, Michael sat with both hands on the steering wheel. He had come intending to walk into the literacy center. Instead, he'd watched through the window as Evelyn and Daniel laughed over something while cleaning up after the volunteers. For the first time since leaving, Michael saw something he hadn't expected. Evelyn wasn't waiting for him anymore, and that realization hurt far more than he had prepared for. Evelyn chose a quiet cafe overlooking the Savannah River. It was public enough to feel safe, but not so crowded that every pause would be overheard. She arrived first. When Michael walked in a few minutes later, she noticed two things immediately. He looked thinner, and he looked nervous. He stopped beside the table. Hi. Hi. For a second, neither of them sat down. Then Michael pulled out the chair across from her. I wasn't sure you'd come. I almost didn't. He nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. A server brought water, asked if they were ready to order, and left after they both declined. Michael rubbed his hands together. I've replayed that night 100 times. Evelyn didn't answer. I keep thinking about how I walked out. Another silence settled between them. Finally, he looked up. I'm sorry. She believed he meant it. That surprised her more than the apology itself. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, he continued. I needed you to know that leaving wasn't your failure. She folded her hands in her lap. Then whose was it? He gave a tired smile. Mine. He looked out toward the river before continuing. When I got promoted, I started spending time with people who always seemed to have more. Bigger homes. He nodded. Better cars, more money, better connections. You used to laugh about those conversations. I know. What changed? Michael didn't answer immediately. I stopped feeling grateful for what I had. His voice was quiet now. I started feeling embarrassed by it. Evelyn held his gaze. Embarrassed by our life? He looked down. By myself. The admission seemed difficult to say aloud. I kept thinking success meant I was supposed to become someone else. And Vanessa? Michael sighed. Vanessa wasn't the beginning. No? No. He shook his head slowly. She represented the life I thought I wanted. And now? I confused excitement with happiness. He smiled sadly. They aren't the same thing. Evelyn let the word settle. She remembered the Friday nights they'd spent arguing over movies, the crooked coffee table, the cake that always leaned to one side. None of those memories hurt anymore. They simply belonged to another version of her life. Michael leaned forward. I know I don't deserve another chance. She appreciated that he hadn't asked for one. I've spent weeks trying to understand why I became someone I barely recognize. Evelyn spoke for the first time in several minutes. I think you already know. He looked at her. You stopped looking at our life. She paused. You only looked at everyone else's. Michael closed his eyes briefly. You're right. Another long silence passed. Neither of them seemed uncomfortable with it. Finally, Michael asked the question he'd been carrying into the cafe. Is there someone else? Evelyn thought about Daniel, about Saturday mornings, about conversations that never felt rushed. She answered honestly, There's someone I'm getting to know. Michael nodded. I saw him. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. You were outside the literacy center. I couldn't make myself come in. She studied him for a moment. Then she understood. You wanted to see whether I looked happy. He smiled faintly. I think I already knew. When the check arrived, Michael reached for it automatically. Evelyn stopped him. We can split it. He looked at her hand resting lightly on the receipt. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pettiness. It was simply someone no longer depending on him in the way she once had. As they stood outside the cafe, Michael hesitated. I'll always be sorry. Evelyn believed him. I know. He waited. She didn't say anything else, not because she wanted to punish him, because there was nothing left to negotiate. She understood his mistakes now. She even felt compassion for the insecurity that had shaped them. But understanding someone was not the same as trusting them with her future. For the first time since their marriage ended, they walked in opposite directions, without either of them looking back. The Saturday after meeting Michael, Evelyn arrived at the literacy center expecting to feel unsettled. Instead, the morning unfolded the way it always did. Lily wanted another pirate story. Marcus insisted he'd read an extra chapter during the week. Someone had forgotten to put the crayons back in the right container. Life, she realized, had a way of continuing even after conversations that once felt impossible. Daniel looked up from a table where he was helping two sisters choose books. Morning. Morning. How'd it go? She knew what he meant. It was necessary. He nodded once. He didn't ask for details. She appreciated that more than she could explain. The children arrived, filling the room with familiar noise. For the next 2 hours, Daniel was everywhere without ever trying to be noticed. He fixed a broken chair before anyone else saw it wobble. He tied balloons for a reading game because one of the volunteers couldn't manage the knots. When Noah became frustrated over a difficult paragraph, Daniel pulled up a chair instead of correcting him from across the room. Let's figure it out together. There was nothing dramatic about the way he helped people. He simply paid attention. After cleanup, Evelyn carried a box of donated books toward the storage room. Daniel reached for the other side. I've got this. I know. They carried it together anyway. As they set the box down, Daniel leaned against the shelf. I've been thinking about something. That sounds serious. It probably is. She waited. When I recognized you, I could have introduced myself that day. You could have. I almost did. What stopped you? He looked toward the doorway before answering. I wasn't sure whether you'd treat me differently if you knew who I was. Evelyn frowned. You mean because of the company? He nodded. I've spent enough years wondering whether people were interested in me or what came with me. So you decided not to tell me. I wanted one place where I could simply be Daniel. She considered that quietly. I hope that wasn't unfair. She smiled. It was human. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. I kept waiting for the right time. There probably wasn't one. I've reached the same conclusion. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by shelves of donated books. Finally, Evelyn spoke. You know what's strange? What? You were worried I'd treat you differently after finding out who you are. And? I already had. He looked puzzled. I treated you like the man who fixes bookshelves, gets marker stains on his hands, and somehow remembers every child's favorite book. A smile slowly spread across Daniel's face. That's oddly specific. It's also true. She shrugged. I don't know much about billion-dollar companies. I've noticed. I know the names of 37 children who finally finished their first chapter books this year. I think that's more impressive. She laughed. No, it's simply my world. And I'm beginning to like your world. The words slipped out before he could soften them. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Not because the moment was uncomfortable, because neither wanted to rush past it. Outside, children were saying goodbye to their parents in the parking lot. Inside, another volunteer turned off the lights in the reading room. Evelyn looked at Daniel. "You know what I like most about Saturdays?" He shook his head. "They're ordinary." He smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." She understood then why being around him felt so different. Michael had gradually taught her to believe ordinary wasn't enough. Daniel never seemed to be searching for something bigger than the moment he was already in. As they locked the front doors together, Evelyn realized trust hadn't returned all at once. It had been rebuilding itself in small, forgettable moments. A shared box of books, a conversation left unfinished, someone who kept showing up exactly when they said they would. Those things didn't look extraordinary. Maybe that was the point. Michael hadn't planned to stop at the literacy center. He'd been driving home from a client meeting when he noticed the familiar brick building a block away. Before he could talk himself out of it, he'd turned into a parking space across the street. He sat in the car for several minutes. The engine was off. His hands rested on the steering wheel. He told himself he only wanted to know whether Evelyn was doing all right. He wasn't entirely sure he believed that. Through the front windows, he could see children moving between bookshelves. Volunteers drifted from table to table, helping where they were needed. Then he spotted Evelyn. She was kneeling beside a little girl who couldn't have been older than 7. The child's bookmark had slipped between 2 pages, and she looked close to tears. "It's okay," Evelyn said, smiling. "We'll find your place together." The girl nodded. Within seconds, they were reading again. Michael remembered seeing that same patience at home. She'd shown it when he worked late, when projects fell apart, when he worried about deadlines. He had accepted it so naturally that he'd eventually stopped noticing it. His attention shifted across the room. Daniel was helping 2 boys build a tower out of oversized alphabet blocks, while another volunteer laughed nearby. No one treated him differently. No one hovered around him. No one seemed to know or care that he had once built and sold a company worth billions. To the children, he was simply the man who never got tired of helping. Michael watched Daniel pick up a stack of books without being asked. A few minutes later, Evelyn joined him. She said something Michael couldn't hear. Daniel answered. She laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of laugh that arrived without permission. Michael realized he hadn't heard that sound in a very long time. He expected jealousy. Instead, he felt something quieter, regret, not because another man was standing beside her, because he finally understood what she'd been trying to protect all those years. Their life had never been ordinary. It had been steady. There was a difference. He remembered the Friday nights he'd once dismissed as repetitive, the crooked coffee table he'd wanted to replace, the conversations interrupted by television commercials, the weekends spent wandering farmers markets without buying much of anything. At some point, he'd started believing those moments were evidence that his life wasn't moving forward. Now they looked like the very things he'd been searching for in all the wrong places. Across the room, one of the younger volunteers accidentally knocked over a container of colored pencils. They scattered across the floor. Without thinking, Evelyn and Daniel both bent down to help gather them. Their hands bumped. They looked at each other, smiled, then finished picking up the pencils before either said a word. Nothing about the moment was dramatic. That was what made it impossible to ignore. Michael reached for the car keys, then stopped. For weeks he'd imagined walking into the literacy center, apologizing again, and somehow finding the words that would undo everything. Watching Evelyn now, he understood that wasn't what she needed. She wasn't waiting to be rescued from the life he had left behind. She was already building another one. He started the engine. Before pulling away, he looked at the building one last time. "I hope you're happy," he said aloud, though no one could hear him. Then he drove away. Inside the literacy center, Evelyn watched a child proudly finish the last page of a book. She never saw Michael's car disappear around the corner. Some goodbyes, she would later learn, happened without either person saying another word. The weeks after meeting Michael passed more quietly than Evelyn expected. There wasn't a sudden sense of relief. There wasn't a dramatic moment when everything finally made sense. Life simply kept asking her to show up. She unlocked the library each morning. She read stories to children who argued over which character was funniest. She watered the small fern on the circulation desk because no one else remembered. The ordinary routines that once felt like obligations gradually became reminders that her life had never stopped moving. One Saturday afternoon, after the literacy center had emptied, Evelyn and Daniel sat on a wooden bench beneath the same oak tree where he'd first asked if she remembered him. For a while, they watched parents buckle children into car seats. A little boy waved enthusiastically through the back window of an SUV. Daniel waved back. "You know," Evelyn said, "I used to think healing would feel bigger than this." "What does it feel like?" She considered the question. "I don't check my phone hoping Michael has changed." She smiled to herself. "I didn't even realize I'd stopped doing that." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes the biggest changes are the ones we don't notice while they're happening." She looked down at her hands. "When Michael left, I thought I'd lost the best version of myself." He didn't interrupt. "I spent months wondering what I should have done differently." She traced a circle on the bench with one finger. Talked more, argued more, paid more attention. She paused. "Now I think I disappeared long before he walked out." Daniel turned toward her. "What do you mean?" "I made his dreams my entire world." She shrugged gently. "I don't regret supporting him." "No, but somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I wanted my own life to become." The words surprised even her. She hadn't planned to say them aloud. Daniel let the silence settle before speaking. "I don't think the woman I've come to know disappeared." She looked at him. "I think she spent years making room for everyone else." A breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Evelyn smiled. "That's a kinder way of saying it." "It's the truthful way." For a few moments, they listened to the sounds of children laughing in the nearby playground. Then Daniel spoke again. "I've been thinking about us." She met his eyes, but said nothing. "I don't want to rush you." "You don't. I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything because of the past." "I don't. And I don't want to become the person who arrives right after someone else leaves." His voice was steady. "I'd rather be the person who walks beside you, if that's something you ever want." Evelyn felt the difference immediately. There was no promise of forever, no attempt to sweep away everything that had happened, only an invitation, with room to decline. She smiled softly. "That's a very careful question. I've had time to think about it. And if my answer isn't today, I'll still be here next Saturday helping Noah with chapter books." She laughed. "He'll probably still pretend he hates reading." "He will. And you'll probably still fix that crooked bookshelf. I've accepted that's my permanent assignment." The laughter faded naturally. Evelyn reached over and rested her hand lightly on his. "I don't know exactly what the future looks like." "I don't either. But I do know one thing." He waited. "If we're going to build anything together." She squeezed his hand gently. "I need honesty. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then." Daniel didn't hesitate. "You'll have it." There was no grand declaration, no audience, just two people sitting beneath an old oak tree, choosing truth before certainty. As they stood to leave, Evelyn realized something she hadn't understood months earlier. Healing hadn't come from proving Michael wrong. It hadn't come from replacing one relationship with another. It had come from finding the parts of herself that had been waiting patiently all along. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking toward someone else's future. She was walking toward her own. 2 weeks later, Daniel called Evelyn on a Thursday evening. "Are you free Saturday after the literacy center?" "I should be. I'd like to show you something." "Should I be worried?" He laughed. "Only if you don't like surprises." "I'll take my chances." Saturday came and went, much as it always did. By early afternoon, the last family had left. Volunteers locked the storage room, and Daniel walked Evelyn to the parking lot. Instead of turning toward home, he gestured to his truck. "Come with me." She smiled. "I suppose this is where you finally tell me where we're going. You'll recognize it when we get there." 20 minutes later, they pulled into a familiar parking lot. Evelyn looked through the windshield. The public library. She turned to Daniel. "You brought me back." "I thought it was time." They walked through the front doors together. Some of the furniture had changed. The computers were newer. The children's reading corner had been painted brighter colors, but the building still carried the same quiet feeling she remembered. She smiled as she looked around. I spent 6 years here. I know. You've done your homework. I had help. The retired branch manager still remembered you. Evelyn laughed. I hope that's a good sign. She said you always knew everyone's name. They wandered slowly through the building. When they reached the printing area, Daniel stopped. It happened right here. She looked at the printer. I still wish I remembered. I'm glad you don't. He smiled. It reminds me that kindness doesn't need an audience to matter. Before she could answer, the library director approached them. Evelyn? She looked up, surprised. Mrs. Harrison? The older woman smiled warmly. I heard you might be coming. They hugged. It's been years. It has. Mrs. Harrison turned to Daniel. I think everything's ready. Evelyn frowned. Everything? Daniel reached into his jacket and handed her a folder. She opened it. Inside was a proposal bearing the library's letterhead. She read the first page slowly. Then the second. Her eyes lifted. Daniel. Oh, he smiled. I'd like us to create it together. The proposal outlined a permanent community literacy and emergency assistance fund. It would cover printing costs for job applications, scholarships for literacy programs, books for children whose families couldn't afford them, and emergency educational expenses for anyone facing financial hardship. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten sentence. No one should lose an opportunity because they couldn't afford the first step. Evelyn closed the folder carefully. You've already planned all of this. I've planned the funding. He looked at her, but not the purpose. She waited. That belongs to both of us. Mrs. Harrison quietly excused herself, leaving them alone. For several moments, Evelyn said nothing. Finally, she looked around the library. I used to think my biggest contribution here was keeping books on the shelves. Daniel shook his head. You reminded people they mattered. She smiled. I didn't always know if it made a difference. It made mine. He paused. And I have a feeling there are people neither of us will ever meet whose lives will change because of what starts here. Evelyn looked through the glass wall toward the entrance. A young man stood at the printing station, counting the coins in his hand before checking his pocket again. Without saying a word, one of the librarians walked over and quietly handed him a small card. He smiled with visible relief. Evelyn watched him leave for an interview he would probably never know had been made possible by strangers who believed in second chances. She turned back to Daniel. I'd like to help build this. He smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. As they signed the first documents that afternoon, neither of them spoke about billion-dollar companies or broken marriages. They spoke about children's books, community, and the quiet dignity of giving someone enough help to keep moving. Years earlier, one forgotten act of kindness had connected two strangers for only a few minutes. Now that same kindness was becoming something neither of them could have imagined. It would belong to an entire community. Autumn arrived quietly in Savannah. The mornings became cooler. Children walked into the literacy center carrying backpacks that seemed almost as large as they were, eager to tell Evelyn and the volunteers about new teachers, spelling tests, and library books they had already finished. Some things had changed. Many things hadn't. Daniel still arrived before everyone else. If a table needed repairing, he repaired it. If donated books needed sorting, he sorted them. If a child struggled through a page, he never reached for the answer before giving them time to find it themselves. He had never stopped showing up. Evelyn noticed that consistency long before she noticed anything else. Their relationship grew the same way, not through dramatic promises, not through expensive trips or public declarations. It grew through ordinary Tuesdays when Daniel dropped off donated books after work, through phone calls that ended with, "Drive safely," through disagreements that ended with conversations instead of silence, through honesty, especially on days when honesty was uncomfortable. One evening, they locked the literacy center together after a volunteer meeting. Daniel looked at her. You know. What? I spent years believing the biggest thing that ever happened to me was selling my company. And now? He smiled. I think it was meeting a librarian who didn't remember meeting me. She laughed. I still feel bad about that. I don't. He reached for her hand. It reminds me that the best things people do are often the ones they never keep score of. She squeezed his hand. I hope we never keep score. I don't think we will. Across town, Michael was learning a different kind of lesson. The apology he had offered Evelyn had not restored what he had lost. Over time, he stopped wishing it would. Instead, he began paying attention to the habits he had ignored for years. He accepted fewer projects that pulled him away from his family. He visited his parents more often. He volunteered through a local career mentoring program, helping young professionals avoid measuring their worth by promotions and salaries alone. The regret remained. He understood. It probably always would. But regret no longer became an excuse to stand still. It became a reminder of the man he never wanted to become again. Months later, the Literacy and Emergency Assistance Fund officially opened. There was no television crew, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just librarians, volunteers, teachers, parents, and children filling the meeting room with conversation. A small plaque hung near the printing station. It didn't mention Daniel's company. It didn't mention his wealth. It simply read, "Everyone deserves the chance to begin." Evelyn stood nearby as a high school senior printed college scholarship applications without worrying about whether he had enough money to cover the cost. She smiled. The moment reminded her of a day she still couldn't fully remember. Maybe she never would. And that was all right. Late that afternoon, familiar voices echoed through the reading room. The children were arriving for story hour. Noah hurried inside carrying the newest adventure book he wanted to discuss. Lily proudly announced she had finished another chapter book all by herself. Marcus immediately began debating whether pirates were still better than astronauts. Some arguments, Evelyn thought, would never end. She welcomed each child by name. Daniel carried another stack of books to the reading corner. Their eyes met across the room. Neither of them needed to say anything. They were exactly where they wanted to be. As the children settled onto the colorful rug, Evelyn opened the first book and looked around the room. Years earlier, she had believed kindness was simply part of her job. She had never imagined that a few encouraging words, a stack of printed pages, and a stranger having a difficult day would one day shape the course of so many lives, including her own. The story she thought had ended with betrayal had quietly become the beginning of something better. Not because life had erased the pain, but because love had finally been measured by something deeper than promises. It was measured by who kept showing up, again and again, especially when there was nothing to gain. The end.